Today on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Mazen, you and Stephen just used a phrase that I don't think I've heard used on this podcast. I've heard used for years everywhere else, which is backbone therapy. And I'm wondering if, in fact, we're going to wind up with a different backbone at each point in therapy.
My unconscious said that word, backbone. And let me give the example of lanifibranor. A lot of our patients that have fibrosis are diabetics. We have to see more data. If Lenny does the trick for type 2 diabetes and lipid and the heart, it might stay as a backbone therapy. Not all drugs will stay as backbone therapy for a long time.
The good news, Mazen, is there are 33 bones in the back. Only 24 are movable, though.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guest, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Mazen Noureddin, as they discuss why a strategy of escalating and de-escalating therapies might be the future for NAFLD and NASH treatment, this week on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For everyone with interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 26 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now. First, you may have learned by now that we had a problem uploading the conversations from Episode 25 over the weekend. That's been fixed. We have an explanation and a raffle announcement in the business section of today's podcast, but let's not worry about that for now. Instead, let's move on to our episode, okay? We have with us Mazen Noureddin, who is a newly proud papa. Mazen, how's the diaper changing business going?
Very good and efficient. I'm getting better at it every day.
How many are you doing a day now, Mazen? 8?
We're not that bad.
Or maybe it should be 8, and you're letting them go a little longer between changes.
We have a newborn and 2.5, so we're doing both.
I figured that 8 probably was a conservative number for a newborn and a 2.5.
Well, let me put it this way. You don't count, you feel better. Just do it.
That's Mazen's joy. Stephen's joy, as we speak off the beach in Panama City. Stephen, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. I'm all lubed up with my SPF 30 and I've got my margarita not in hand. It's waiting for me at the beach, but doing well. Glad to be here and glad to be celebrating a victory for my daughter. Maybe we'll talk about that in a moment.
We'll get to that in personal bests. And Louise has none of that to be happy about, but she has this phenomenal goal that Alison Becker scored yesterday that might keep Liverpool in the Champions League.
Or at least give us a fair shot. Awesome header is all I can say.
It was pretty brilliant. It would have been brilliant even if you weren't the keeper. And then just a nice time of year. And here we are in Pennsylvania. Stephen, before we came on, actually showed everybody the view out his window. I'm not going to try to do that because I could wreck too much sound equipment, but it's a gorgeous day here. Let's get started. We'll start by just talking about personal bests because I think everybody's got one. And then after that, we will dive into what I think is going to be a really fascinating episode. Stephen, since you set this up, why don't you go first?
Well, I was going to say we need to let Mazen go first, and then I can fast forward 18 years and tell him what to expect.
Yeah, there's an old Stephen Sondheim musical, Merrily We Roll Along, which is that in reverse. You start in the end and work back to the beginning. So you can try that too.
I honestly have been home, as you guys said, changing diapers. I'm proud to help my wife. I took off work, but continued to do research during this time. Yeah, it has been a blessing to be with the family. You know, my parents live with me, so it's a family time. It's a blessing. And I think during COVID, we learned that before COVID, like it was work, get goals accomplished. But with COVID, we learned a lot about family and how to get closer to them. So cannot be more blessed that my family is around helping with the kids.
And Mazen sent me a picture of his family last night, and his daughters are beautiful. And I remember when mine were roughly the same age, a little further apart, but roughly the same age. It's truly just a joyous time of life. Loving the smile on your faces. I'm looking at you right now. Okay, Stephen, fast forward 18 years.
Yeah, and you're adding to the family. That's great. You took COVID as an opportunity to expand. I like that.
COVID babies. That's what they're called. Millennials and COVID. They're millennials and these people are going to be called COVID babies.
COVID babies. All right. Well, I've got a COVID graduate. So Anna Lauren is my 18-year-old that she officially graduates from high school a week from, well, this coming Saturday, so 5 days from now. She more recently culminated her cheerleading career with a trip to what's called the D2 Summit in Disney World in Orlando and competing against world-class athletes. They came in third, which was an amazing achievement, I think. Looking at the competition, I didn't think we had a prayer, but somehow 30 girls were able to come together and do it twice without making a mistake. They did it once in the prelims and again in the finals and were able to walk away third. So we're very proud of her. And then we drove her up here to meet with her senior class that made a trip down to what I affectionately call the Redneck Riviera in Panama City Beach. And of course, mom and dad decided to stay an extra day, socially distanced by 6 miles from my daughter, I might add. So she doesn't know we're actually on the same beach as her and we can't embarrass her. But I'm really looking for that 6-mile jog up the beach to find her, and wave and yell her name real loud and say, "Hey, Dad's here." She would never acknowledge my presence. But anyway, that's what happens 18 years from now, Mazen. They will always love you, but there's a period where they're like, Dad, just drop me off around the corner.
Stay away.
For those of you who know Stephen as a glass is half full kind of guy, more as a there are 2 gulps of water left in the glass kind of guy, I will note that I got a text message from him right before the competition suggesting that these girls were amazing and it would be great if Ann Lauren's group could make it to the finals. And then another one 24 hours later saying, I don't know how these girls are going to compete in the finals. These other teams are just amazing. And then one saying they finished third with 3 exclamation points, which is the Stephen I think we all know. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And enjoy the Riviera. Redneck though it might be. Louise, what you got?
Oh, God, nothing on these guys. Just congratulate both of the guys and Mazen and his wife on their new arrival, and Stephen for obviously cheerleading support, but getting to Disney and then to Panama City, just winding me up. We've got rain here, but we are out of a further lockdown, so I'm looking forward to hugging my parents and things with caution, as the Prime Minister says. But apart from Liverpool scoring a very last-minute winner the other night, just rolling on, getting vaccinations done in the Excel for me.
That's great.
My news is real simple. My wife got a promotion last week to do something she's really excited about. My niece got a promotion last week to do something she's really excited about. When you work for yourself, it's hard to get a promotion. You can give yourself one, but I'm not sure exactly what it's worth. But that's all been great, and they're doing fantastically. Very, very exciting stuff. With that...
Roger?
Yeah.
Can I promote you?
Go ahead.
Chief Broadcast Officer. CBO. You just got promoted.
Congratulations on your promotion, Roger.
Thank you, Mazen.
Chief Broadcast Officer for NASH.
Oh, Chief Broadcast Officer. I like it. Usually when I've been called a CBO before the B has not been printable, so I'm very, very excited to have this new title. Thank you, Mazen.
What that comes with is an opportunity to play basketball one-on-one against me.
There you go.
Actually, I'm going to broadcast when you two play one-on-one is what's going to happen.
He didn't want to see me dunk over his head. That's the thing.
Yeah, but you don't want to see him bury threes. It'll be really an interesting thing.
But it's not as funny. Dunking versus throwing a 3. Come on.
My money's on Mazen here.
No.
I think he's trying to challenge me, but that's okay. I'm not going to challenge him because I think he will dunk over me. So I accept that.
We'll have to have a double AASLD basketball dunk off versus 3-point shooter or something.
You could do that the weekend of June 17th and 18th, right? You don't even have to wait until November.
Well, that's all virtual.
But then, look, a virtual dunk off is the best kind because you can put a picture of yourself doing anything.
I can do 360s virtually.
All right, we're on a schedule, so let's move forward. This episode I'm really excited about. This stems from the last part of episode 16, which was when Mazen Les joined us before the baby, to discuss his work on cost effectiveness. I asked a question about the price points at which different therapy medications might be used in broader population, and Mazen suggested the idea that we might have expensive therapies for a limited period of time and then revert to diet and exercise or less expensive ones, to which Stephen said, and I quote, "This could be another discussion in itself." So we scheduled one. During NASH Congress last week, Sunil Hosmane noted how important this issue might be and why it made the development of inexpensive tests with high ROX so important. He wanted to join us today. It's his first day back from vacation. He's not having the good fortune you guys are having, so he's loaded into meetings and couldn't make it. Let's just start with, how would we treat in a world where we're going to escalate and then as patients get better, think about de-escalation as a standard part of therapy? Stephen, Mazen, either one of you guys jump in first. You both raised this issue.
I don't mind jumping in. When you go first, you get to kind of free-for-all, right? And you go second, you have to think about something the other guy didn't say. So I'll go first. I see the treatment of NASH, that landscape is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, 2019 was really the year of negative reporting of drugs. 2020, we began to see positive readouts on early phase trials. 2021, we continue to see positive readouts on both end of treatment phase 2s, interim analysis of phase 2s, and more companies proceeding into phase 3. Those that are in phase 3 have either faded away, which is what Sinacrivaroc did, are on hold, like Aramcol. To the best of my knowledge, it's still on hold, or they're moving forward towards completion of Subpart H enrollment, which would be Madrigal's resmetirom. So all these drugs covering a multitude of mechanisms, there will be many that make it across the finish line, in my opinion. And then we're going to talk about combination therapies. But as it stands today, I begin to break these into two different camps. And I think I mentioned this on the podcast before. There's the orals and injectables. And the injectables, I think right now suggest that they're more potent. They're more like the hare and the tortoise in the hare race. They can delipidate livers very quickly, at least the 19s and the 21s that have reported out. Some of the 21s, particularly 89bio's drug and Akero's drug. Of course, aldafermin has reported both the 1 milligram and 3 milligram data, and then semaglutide as a GLP-1. All can work very well against NASH and its components of the NAS. Fibrosis, the GLP-1s have a bit of work to do to show me that they can improve fibrosis, but they all come at a price. There's AE profiles associated with that, particularly GI tolerability issues. Now, again, we've always said if the juice is worth the squeeze, go for it. If the view's worth the climb the hill. And that's what these injectables are offering. Very potent drugs that can move the needle in a positive way. But I think they're cut out for more advanced stages of disease. We're going to hit them hard. We're going to hit them for a finite period of time. And then we're going to de-escalate their therapy to something oral, extremely well tolerated, that they could take for a prolonged period of time. Remember, most of these people are asymptomatic and they want to remain that way. On the other hand, the oral drugs that we have marching through are also gaining in promise and efficacy, as well as minimizing their side effect profiles. We used to think of the FXRs as really the potential future backbone therapy of NASH, and I think we've kind of pivoted away from that a little bit just because of some of the issues with that class of drug relative to the higher you dose, the more frequent AEs we have with LDL and pruritus. So pivoting away from that, we've got a lot of drugs advancing through phase 2B into 3, and I think are going to be effective treatments as backbone therapies and for the long run, but they're being studied more as treatment for moderate NASH, I would say F2 to advance to F3, and that's something that those patients can be on for a while. So if you begin to talk about escalation, de-escalation, it depends on what stage of disease you're in. If you're a well-compensated F4, I believe we will continue to show data that we can reverse cirrhosis in NASH. We got a flavor of that from efruxifermin. I think that is just a tip of the iceberg on what we're likely to see. Many of these trials are initiating in well-compensated cirrhotics, and I think we'll begin to see that needle move in a positive direction. But that's going to be hit them hard, pull them back from the edge of the cliff, and transition them over to something that not only impacts their liver, but also has a benefit extrahepatically on atherogenic lipids and glycemic control. And if you've got the holy grail of weight loss that goes along with it, that would be super. So that's my initial take. Maybe, Mazen, you can tell me your thoughts.
Josh, how can you add anything to that, Stephen? You're right. You cannot do much as the second person, especially from Stephen Harrison. Let me try to take a jab of this after Stephen. Let me start with this. I think it's going to be an art treating the NASH patients. And I think I'm looking at the things very optimistically that we're going to have multiple drugs, that they're going to be approved. And I'm looking at the type 2 diabetes world, that we're going to have multiple medications that we're going to choose from. The less optimistic group I have hope for as of today, I hope it's going to change in the future, is the compensated cirrhotics. So I'm actually going to break this field into multiple things. We, the hepatologists and the endocrinologists, will be the people who are going to manage these patients because of the complexity of making the decision between two things, the medications and the NITs. If you end up with one medication, you're going to have to make a complex decision on combination of NITs or the other way around. And you're likely going to end up with combo at one point. So I'm going to break it into F4, F3, and F2. You're also going to have injectables and orals. And you're going to also have special populations, meaning people that they are lean. So you're not going to lose weight loss drug with lean people like semaglutide. You cannot use it with a BMI of 25, for instance. You're going to have people with IBS, GI side effects. A lot of our medications, they have GI side effects. So you're going to think differently in these patients. But let me just give examples, start with the F3 groups. And before I start there, also, we have to think also about the heart, because some people might have underlying heart disease or not. But we also have to think about reversing any potential future cardiovascular side effects, because we have to keep in mind that these patients also die from the heart. So if I have an F3 patient, in my mind, this is kind of like a time bomb. At least as a hepatologist, I'm biased not to get to F4. And I want to reverse this patient at least to F2 or F1 as soon as I can. So in my mind, if I get such a patient, I want to use anti-fibrotic as fast as I can. I want more data on the FGFs, but they look promising. Lanifibranor looks like it can hit multiple things at the same time, maybe fibrosis and cardiovascular profile, but maybe this is a group that I can use a combination from the get-go, maybe FGFs and LANI, and try to reverse them back and leave them alone, maybe with LANI on the long term, so I continue that LANI alone that will continue to take care of NASH as well as the cardiovascular profile. Or also as a maintenance, you can continue resmetirom on these patients. But I want to hit fibrosis early on as much as I can in these patients. Also, these F3 patients, those are the group that I can, at least for now, based on the data, I can worry about SEMA early on less. I'm not going to jump necessarily and use SEMA on these people early on. I want to reverse fibrosis. At one point, after I reverse fibrosis, I might use SEMA in the future 2 years, 3 years for a 1 year period of time, especially if it's expensive, to reverse their weight and drop that 16% or 20% over 1 year. Maybe the insurance would not allow me more than that, and then continue another backbone therapy. So you see here, there's a lot of complexity, but also some deep thinking and art into it. Versus if I go to the F2 patient, you can start with SEMA can be a first-line therapy, and for a year they drop weight. You have some positive effects on the heart. You can later on switch to resmetirom or lanifibranor, or you can start with lanifibranor all along on these patients. So I think it's going to be different pockets of patients. If I go to the compensated cirrhosis, the data, I'm waiting for the data to show me, and Stephen alluded to some of these data that we started seeing on the compensated cirrhosis. But I think I want to hit these patients from the get-go to start with probably 2 anti-fibrotic, reverse that, and keep going. So this is kind of like he and I were doing like crystal ball for the future, but I think it's going to vary per patient fibrosis stage and underlying condition.
Thanks, both of you, for great places to start. Mazen, you and Stephen just used a phrase that I don't think I've heard used on this podcast, but I've heard used for years everywhere else, which is backbone therapy. And I'm wondering if, in fact, we're going to wind up with a backbone therapy in this disease, or will we wind up with a definition of what would make something an appropriate backbone, but the specific nature of disease in F2 versus F3 versus F4 means there may be a different backbone at each point in therapy?
I was told often, I get myself in trouble, but my unconscious said that word, backbone, and let me stick to it for a second. I'll just give the example of lanifibranor. A lot of our patients that have fibrosis are diabetics. We have to see more data. If LANI does the trick for type 2 diabetes and lipid and the heart, it might stay as a backbone therapy. Not all drugs will stay as backbone therapy probably for a long time.
The good news, Mazen, is there are 33 bones in the back. So you could have 33 different backbone drugs for NASH. Only 24 are movable, though.
Okay. It sounds like you wanted to go for orthopedics. I forgot all this information.
I think, to your point, there will be a therapy. I mean, just like hypertension, right? I mean, we treat a certain percentage of our people with lisinopril or amlodipine or hydrochlorothiazide. I mean, they don't need multiple therapies. There's some that will get by with a therapy. And then there's those that really we can begin to build off of. It's important to think about how these are going to come to market. We all agree if Intercept's drug comes to market, that'll be huge for the NASH community. I don't think it'll be necessarily huge for our patients. patients with NASH because it's going to be restricted. My guess is if it does get approved, it'll be restricted to a finite population of patients with some pretty strict safety protocols built in. What's likely to come is resmetirom as it completes Subpart H enrollment, and we wait a year and then they collect data and file the NDA. The word out there is sometime in second, third quarter 2023, that drug is likely to be approved for NASH, assuming it meets Subpart H approval and safety record is held in place. So kind of by default, if that's the only drug approved, it becomes the backbone therapy. And then people begin to build off of it, unless you want to go off-label and use a GLP-1 off-label or pioglitazone or vitamin E. I think what's likely to happen is that backbone therapy will start with whatever is approved, and then we'll see how that real-world experience plays out, where people are having successes, where it's not seeming to work, because let's be real, it's not going to work in every patient, and it may have better effects in different stages of disease than others. It may have better effects in different ethnicities. Let's not forget one thing I wanted to mention at the beginning, Roger, was this notion of a polygenic risk score. I think that's really going to come into play in the next couple of years and drive identification of these really rapid progressors of NASH, this high-risk population, and we don't yet know how these drugs behave relative to those polygenic risk scores. That's something else that's going to come into play. I know we're bouncing all over the place here a little bit off of your first comment, but there's some things that Mazen's saying that triggers thoughts in my mind, and I'm sure vice versa, and Louise as well, and you. So this is that free thought, free association that we're doing as we talk about this crystal ball of drug development and where we're headed. But there's a lot of variables at play, as Mazen's mentioned. But I think just pragmatically, we start with what's likely to be approved, get its utilization in different populations, and see where we go.
If you don't mind, Roger, for a second, I want to just carry on this conversation as Stephen. I totally agree with you with your timeline thinking and putting resmetirom as probably potential first real-world example that based on the projection of the data that it's probably going to be, hopefully OCA will be approved, but it could be resmetirom is the first one be approved. Which brings me to the topic. If resmetirom gets approved and it does have good effect on lipid panel, we don't talk about the length of treatment. When we started this business, if you want to call it, we said we'll treat NASH, and now the clinical trials called for F2 and higher. There are some F1s and then the phase 3s. The question is the stopping point. So let's say you have resmetirom F3 patient, you bring them down to F1. Is that a stopping point or insurance stopping point? Or this insurance will stop you when you defatten the liver and ALT is normal. You can argue at that point, well, it's improving the lipid and the patient had dyslipidemia, just keep him on it. So those are all unanswered questions. Some of the drugs will be stopped, other will not be stopped, and that's something we never talked about to be proven in the future.
Louise, I want to bring you into the conversation, but I want to make one comment first. I'm hard-pressed to think of a major chronic disease drug class in the U.S. that's seen that kind of de-escalation. Now, in terms of how people get to backbone therapy, the first class to show up tends to be the backbone therapy for a while, but then something else can easily take over, so that if you look at the history of blood pressure, for example, hydrochlorothiazides were backbone therapy until there were beta blockers. Beta blockers were backbone therapy until there were calcium channel blockers, which made the world more complicated, and eventually ACEs and ARBs took over a lot of that role. But at any given moment, that was a moving target. Diabetes, once metformin showed up, for the longest time, that was the backbone therapy. And eventually everything started in metformin, particularly after it went generic. But what I don't think we've seen a ton of is the addition of drugs to regress a disease and then the removal of those drugs from the therapeutic profile. Y'all have been talking about that. I think that's historic. Let's just put it that way. And I think really interesting.
Well, I think, if you want to be a player in the market for the long run, you got to not only improve liver disease, but you've got to have some type of pleiotropic effect on extrahepatic metabolism. You've got to move glycemia in a positive way, or you've got to move atherogenic lipids, or ideally both. One of the things we're talking about at the Emerging Topic Conference, I believe Brent Tetry is going to be speaking on what is the ideal NASH drug. What does it look like? Is it an oral, once daily, no side effect, hits NASH, hits fibrosis, atherogenic lipids, glycemic control, weight loss. That's kind of like the ideal drug. But is there any out there? No, there's not today. But it's a goal to shoot for. It's certainly an aspiration. But the reality is, Mazen brought this up at the beginning, we're going to use NITs to drive response to therapy. Where we're at with that is we're still trying to refine magnitude of effect changes and what that means relative to histopathologic changes. But PDFF has come a long way, and drugs that actually move liver fat, like the 21s, like the 19s, like the THR betas, some haven't been studied. You brought up Lani, Mazen. I don't have any data on Lani with PDFF. In fact, if you look at their presentation, they talk about 2-point improvement in the NAS. They talk about NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement, but there's no comment made about steatosis. That mechanism, I've yet to see a lot of data seeing what happens with NITs relative to Lani. They're out there for sure. ALT has been shown to be agnostic to mechanism. PDFF generally is if you're a metabolic drug, although there are drugs that aren't moving PDFF that appear to be having positive impacts on other NITs, or even histology like a PPAR delta like seladelpar. There's additional data coming with MR elastography. There's, of course, your MAST score and other components of combining MR with clinical biomarkers. So we're moving there, we're getting there, and I think that will drive this paradigm of whether we switch drugs, add drugs, change combos, or whatnot will be driven by AE profiles, patient wishes, payers willing to pay for drug A over B, and then ultimately efficacy.
And cost. I totally agree with all what you said. And Roger, to the point you said about backbone is not going to be straightforward. Let's say resmetirom is the first drug that's going to get approved. Again, we sincerely hope that OCA will be approved. Let's just assume for this conversation, resmetirom. I think sema is a great drug, but I don't think it's straightforward backbone therapy. It has been on the market for type 2 diabetes. It's not an easy access. It's very hard to approve by insurances. It's expensive drug, and not all type 2 diabetes patients gets it. So logically, you cannot rely on that as backbone therapy. It's going to be short-term therapy, especially now it doesn't have fibrosis signal for our patients. Same as for other injectables, they probably not going to be your backbone therapy. It's going to probably be short because it just costs more to manufacture them. So it's way more complex than just say, well, the next drug after resmetirom is going to replace it. No, cost is going to dictate what is going to replace and what's not going to replace that, in addition to side effects and long-term cardiac and all that.
I think both the guys are absolutely right. There will be escalation and de-escalation in the F4 categories that have to happen more or less immediately. I think F3, yes, we have a little bit more time. When we talk about backbone, I was taken back to Suzanne Norris's presentation at the NASH Symposium, where she was showing quite a lot of data on just minor changes in exercise, diet, that again made significant change. Will we be forced to that to be the backbone? And that was her question, is what will a patient have to have achieved or failed to achieve to get access to some of these medications? There's some ballpark figures of $15,000 to $20,000 a year. Is that not what's going to be the backbone for a lot of patients in lower stages, that you have to go through a more coordinated dietetics, exercise, non-invasive monitoring? I've been recently doing some patients, and 77% of the patients that I've been doing with serial fibroscans have dropped their liver fat. So what do you have to show, for example? And the comment on the ideal NASH drug, but what is the ideal NASH patient? I know a lot of people who are quite prepared to sit and eat what they want and take a drug, but that's not what we've enrolled into clinical trials. We've enrolled people that are going to follow a clinical trial program, not people who just want to eat and have medication. So what if we start to show with all of these drugs that in the real world scenario is we actually just continue to load liver fat and fibrosis despite evidence-based medications in a trial setting with somebody who's compliant changes their liver fat? How are we going to pick the right patient for the right drug? It just raises questions because, as I say, we're not looking at the real world patient, we're looking at a clinical trial patient.
I think weight loss and exercise is absolutely the fundamental first step when they come to our clinic. And we should recommend it to every single patient and keep pressing on it. One step we should all take. Type 2 diabetes patients, nutritionist is covered by insurance. Our NASH patients, it's not yet. Why is that? It's a big mistake. So we should implement that. But also in my mind, we already established that F2 patients and higher, they have increased morbidity and mortality. If you get to F3, 20% of patients get to cirrhosis in a period of time within 2 years. Get the weight loss and exercise going, but I don't think adding medications is the wrong thing to do, starting from F2 and higher. Some of these medications, actually, they will help their diabetes. You don't just type 2 diabetes patients, you start them on medications. So I think we already established that, in my mind, that fine line when to start therapy or not. In my mind, with F2 and higher, I think we should start therapy in addition to weight loss and exercise. And we have that group F0 and F1, that this is where you already have your grace period, that you should try to do anything possible with weight loss and exercise. I have patients in my clinic that some people I know is like, oh, you're cirrhotic, you have NASH cirrhosis, drink a gallon of coffee. It's not going to do anything for that. Coffee, the first recommendation, well, no, it's like HCC screening, endoscopy. Put coffee at the end. Coffee is too late at the cirrhotic stage.
And they should be well on diet and exercise as a first line before they get to you guys, because it's the minority of people who get to see specialists like yourself and Stephen and the consultants that I've worked with. So again, it's about the minority, not the majority.
So what you're going to see in the States, though, Louise, the first line, you're right, will not be Mazen and will not be Stephen, and will not be people who, frankly, are as charismatic and compelling on this set of issues, nor are they as engaged in this set of issues alone. So a lot of folks will take a pass at diet and exercise. If all the other diseases we look at in the States are a guide, we'll take a pass at diet and exercise, and we'll go to drugs fairly quickly, and we'll go to drugs to a significant degree based on what's promoted to them in increasingly short, infrequent exposures to information that will be modulated by guidelines. At least that feels right to me, because that's kind of what everything else feels like. I don't know. Mazen, I see you nodding. Stephen, I see you kind of thinking.
I think Stephen is thinking because he's at the beach having all these chips, guacamole, and margaritas, and Louise is bringing up all these diets. So he's thinking what kind of meal he had today.
Good thing it's not forbidden for hepatologists to have an occasional margarita.
Occasional. Define that, Stephen. Occasional for Stephen.
But seriously, I mean, when you put this in the hands of the lay treatment population, at least in the States, how do you guys think that will be different than what happens when we're talking about how you're going to treat?
One thing we've learned is that you have to keep it simple. This is why we talk about backbone therapy. Backbone therapy is that therapy that's simple, that covers a wide range of disease severities, that hits pleiotropic mechanisms, that hits extrahepatic manifestations of disease in these patients. So that's ultimately going to drive backbone. Now, as you mentioned, that can change. It may start here, and a year or two later, it may pivot to something else. And it didn't mean that the former backbone therapy goes away. It just kind of gets intertwined into the armamentarium as these primary care guys turf those patients to secondary and tertiary providers. That's in our bag of tricks to give the patient. It may not be the frontline drug, but it is still an effective drug that could be used in patients that aren't responding. That's the other thing, is I think these primary care guys will go at whatever is easiest, and they're not going to know when to switch the drug, stop the drug, add drugs. That's all going to happen, I think, at the next level. But even if they do it, they may not know what thresholds to trigger a response or a change, right? That's a whole nother, it gets more and more complicated, right? So we have to keep it simple. Not that they're not intelligent. These guys are brilliant, but they're trying to manage, they're jack of all trades. They manage lots of different diseases. Mazen and I sit at the tip of this iceberg where we're really focused, at least in our research efforts, on one disease state. As a hepatologist, Mazen is much more broad-based than me because he's much younger than me. So he still is in the fight with transplant and everything else, where my efforts are solely focused on really managing fatty liver disease from an NIT and a treatment perspective. So where I can speak to NITs and treatment, I think it's inappropriate of me to expect my primary care or even general GI colleagues to be able to know off the top of their head or even at the flip of an app, what's the right cutoff for PDFF to determine if I should keep a patient on a drug. What about ALT drop? What about an MRE change, a FibroScan KPA change, a CT1 change? Which one do I use? What's the right cutoffs? All those become very complicated. And so I think they're going to start simply, use what's available, and then pivot at that point. In fact, they may start off by saying, I don't mind prescribing this, but Mazen, I need you to help me manage this patient.
I totally agree. It's going to be an art.
We're getting kind of towards the end of our hour. Stephen, what you just sketched out is a world where the primary care doc or the primary GI, primary hep, if there is such a thing, might deal with the patient until it gets complicated, turf the patient out to tertiary, and then take them back. A, will they be able to get them back, do you think? And Mazen, that might be more a question for you than for Stephen. And B, is that ultimately what escalation or de-escalation is going to look like? Different doctors are at different levels where they're comfortable doing different things. So someone slides back down the scale again, however that would work. At that point, they're going to be back in simpler therapies.
The primary care will be very happy sending these patients to us to manage the F2 and F3 patients and try to reverse their fibrosis. They have enough on their plate, and they're very happy for someone else to talk about what Stephen said, the MRI, the CT1, the ALT in combination with ELF and all that. I think they still play a major role in my mind for now, because I'm still not sure when aspirin is indicated and when aspirin is not. We might learn or not when to start statins because of, side effects of medications. But I think they will also continue to follow them all along for the comorbidities. We also might send back some patients, tell them, no, it's not as severe as you thought. Keep them with you and send them back to me when the FibroScan is that much or the ELF is that much. So I think it will be a real partnership. We're going to take the pool of the significant fibrosis, and I mean by that the F2 and higher, to treat them. We're probably going to end up sending them back to the primary care. I don't know at which point. I will probably perfectionists maybe when we defatten the liver, but some people might send them back when they get rid of the fibrosis and let them just manage it with weight loss and exercise.
Do you think this is an opportunity for strengthening comorbidity management teams that are based locally, who can then, there will be sets of tests that cardiology, endocrinology, hepatology, particularly with fatty liver disease population, all need, and can be escalated through either one of the streams depending on what comes back. So they get their FibroScan, they get all of their other tests, they get their bloods, and they're multimorbidity managed, and each one of the partners gets everything, and then we look at them as a whole, because I think then you've got a specialised area that's coordinating these for primary care.
Louise, I'm going to take that one, and I'm going to say something provocative, because that's what we're all about on the podcast, right? 20 years ago, the introduction of the electronic health record was something that was met with a lot of resistance, and people did not want to use. And now if you don't have an electronic health record, people look at you like you're the dinosaur. Everybody has an EMR. I think where we're headed with the complexity of therapy that you just outlined, Louise, and that I mentioned before your comment, is such that we need what's called a digital therapeutic solution. We will build computer-based algorithms that drive the management of these patients, and the computer will eventually dictate what patients' options are at what stage of disease that the computer thinks they are based on the inputs of all the non-invasive tests and the clinical data that's available. They'll route those people to appropriate care points, and if they're mild, they'll be managed through lifestyle modification, and their associated comorbidities will be managed accordingly. If, on the other hand, they're deemed to be moderate, they're going to go to this particular pathway. If they're severe, they're going to go to this particular pathway. And at each of those pathway points, there's further workup that's required, and there's further therapeutic optionality that's available to those patients. But I think only a handful of these guys are ultimately going to be seen by Mazen and myself and others. The majority are going to be cared for by computer-based algorithms. That's the only way we're going to get this right in the future, because of the complexity that we're seeing in the management of these patients. That's what's coming in the future. How far away is it? 5 years? 10 years? Not sure. But that's my prediction.
Thanks, Stephen. Mazen, let me ask you a question. What's the one most important factor, beyond the fact that it's an art, that you think is going to shape the pathway over the next 5 years? It will shape how treatment will evolve. Once you get past the obvious, which is which drugs get approved. Stephen says computer algorithms. We're talking about different specialties and all that. What do you see shaping how this goes forward?
I guess it's drug efficacy, what is going to work and what's going to not. I mean, the results of the clinical trials. I think the ETC conference that Stephen and Rohit arranged will be very informative. But I really think in the next 5 years, we need to have open-minded to move beyond the current assessment of clinical trials outcomes, at least to move to artificial intelligence, like the AI in histology, as well as non-invasive testing. In my mind, if it's too early for the FDA for non-invasive testing, they need to look at ways to improve the histology, because I'm afraid that we're missing something meaningful, or at least a greater magnitude of response with the current histology, or like the placebo is screwing up things that are supposed to. So just being open-minded to things and having more dialogue about how to improve clinical trial performance, which actually is going to translate into clinical trials, especially with NITs, is going to shape the whole field. It depends how fast you get there.
Thanks. That's great. And thanks for being able to join us today.
Thanks, Mazen.
And Mazen, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations again on your beautiful family.
And get some sleep.
Worlds of questions. So, Stephen, one for you, and then Louise, let me let you go next. I know that in a lot of specialties, they're doing that kind of computer algorithmic stuff you're working at right now as an aid to the professions. Right? I know about that in GI, for example. Is anybody doing anything like that in hepatology right now, or are we not far enough along?
Yeah, as far as I know, we're not far enough along to do that yet in hepatology. I'm not aware of that. When it's hepatitis C and you got drugs like Mavyret versus Hepclusa versus others, it's not as important to build algorithmic management decisions, right? You have a positive PCR, viral load detectable, write the script, and you cure the patient 98, 99% of the time. For fatty liver, this is a chronic care management pathway. It's such a heterogeneous disease. It involves such a large percentage of our population. And there will be so many different targets and so many different ways to measure the efficacy of those targets. And then we throw into that a complexity of combination therapies, and those having their own efficacy targets in NITs. And then we throw in polygenic risk scores. And then we throw in the complexity of diabetes and heart disease and kidney disease and sleep apnea and liver cancer. And it just becomes algorithmic almost in the way that we want to manage these people and not miss something, right? So that's the other piece in all this is we don't want to miss a cancer. We don't want to miss the development of renal failure. We don't want to miss an impending heart attack. So how do we manage appropriately here, right? There are some drugs that if you have heart disease and stage 3 fibrosis, maybe a drug that doesn't hit atherogenic lipids, despite the fact that it hits liver disease, is not the ideal drug for you if there's another one that does both, right? So I think even though that other one might be an injectable versus a more well-tolerated oral, you might lean towards a different route of administration if it buys you that extra benefit because of your particular comorbid state. So it's primed for an algorithmic management scheme that's going to be digitally based. How we get there, I don't know. But I think we have the technology now to begin to look at what that might be. And now's the time to do it as we're just beginning to get this data rolling in, because that snowball is going to pick up speed. And the data, I can tell you already, when I sit down and think about abstracts for AA, NASH tag, EASL, they're coming more and more and more frequent. And it's not just me, it's all my other colleagues in the field. The data is proliferating at such a rapid pace that it is becoming harder and harder to keep up with it. Even NITs and drug development is becoming harder in the field of NASH to be on top of your A game and know exactly what's going on with each of those. So we're going to fall back on this eventually. It's just a matter of kind of building it.
I absolutely agree with Stephen, and I think to keep it simple is absolutely vital. And I think you will see the AI Jean has presented on back reading and on his AI projects. You'll get a standard blood film and screening eventually for all GPs that a computer system will read, and I'll put those patients into brackets. And Stephen's right, it's not controversial. I think it's the way to go, because you start that very early in somebody's health pathway and management of their lifestyle and wellness. Again, you pick it up that much earlier, it's become more cost effective, and you pick the right patient for the right drug. And I think he's absolutely right.
I totally agree. The only thing I do believe is that the pace of change will be dictated by how fast drugs come to market and how successful they are and who in fact is motivated to build the algorithm and how successful they are at getting it adopted. Because the question will wind up being about timing. And that, by the way, to use the phrase that Dr. Harrison used that triggered this discussion, that could be a whole nother discussion, is what are the things that are going to happen over the next 5 years that are going to make this faster, slower, or change the pace. So I want to plant a stake in the ground and say we're going to do that at some point. We should be wrapping up right about now. So final question. People listening to this, what should they take away from this that is not controversial, and what should they take away that is controversial? One of each.
What's not controversial is that drugs are coming, and there will be a lot of them. What is controversial is what's going to be the backbone, and how will we escalate or de-escalate therapy based on patients' individual disease characteristics? When will combination therapy come into play? All these there are way more unknowns than there are knowns. What we can say is that drugs are coming. The future looks incredibly bright. Now, we've been saying that, so what's novel and new about this particular statement? I think I can say with more assurity that we are moving the needle on NASH, and we're moving the needle on fibrosis. And for the first time in the history of mankind, I think we can say that we're moving the needle in NASH cirrhosis. So the future does look bright, but there's still a lot of unknowns.
If I had to say what's not controversial, it's that diet, exercise is still the mainstay of all of the treatments that we've got until we get something better. I think if I had to think of something on listening to the discussion today that's probably a bit more controversial, is we will move that much more rapidly if all of the other associated conditions wake up and smell that the liver is intrinsic to the wellness and the improvement of their patients. Because by doing that, we identify the patients at biggest risk fastest and can get them adequate treatment and move forward at a great pace. And I think by identifying more patients, we will move forward quicker, and that needle will move even further, as Stephen describes.
Thanks. I think what's controversial is I don't know how backbone will play out here, or in fact, whether there will be a single backbone. Statins have one. Diabetes has kind of had one and had one for a long time. Hypertension didn't really have a single backbone once it was 10 years into treatment. It had 3 or 4 of them. This may wind up being more like hypertension because there's such distinctions between patients based on severity of disease and concomitant condition. So my controversial statement is there may not be a backbone.
Remember how many backbones there are.
Well, that's right. There may be 24 of them that move. I think that's more to the point. But when people say a backbone, I think they're talking about one. And that I'm not sure is going to happen here. So that would be my controversial. My less controversial would be that integrated algorithms with diet and exercise and behavior change will become important, and they will be facilitated, Stephen, in part by EHR, because that means you can manage all that at once, and in part by the success of wellness programs, Noom, stuff like that, which actually give people ways to do that without the doctor having to drive the whole thing themselves. I know we see things like that happening in GI and a whole bunch of other areas. I think eventually, when we know more about this disease, they'll come here as well.
It is very complex. I think you can take every single patient with NASH and NAFLD, and every single patient will be different. They will respond differently. They may take a different drug. They may eat different food. It's probably one of the most complex conditions. And that's the difficulty that we're having, nailing anything that's specific, because we know that everybody's diet and exercise regimes are different. So
I completely agree with that. That I find totally non-controversial and a great note to close on. We'll be back next week previewing International NASH Day. And by then we will know, I guess, we will know if Liverpool's in the Champions League, won't we, by then? So that'll be exciting. So with that, let me start by saying goodbye to my colleagues for today. Mazen, much joy and sweetness with your new family. Stephen, much relaxation and pleasure with your frozen margarita on Panama City Beach. And Louise, good luck this weekend getting back to seeing and hugging people, and maybe Liverpool making its way back into the Champions League. We'll know that by next week. Now let's go on to the business section of the paper.
Our chief broadcasting officer discusses Conversation Gate.
Some 150 of you probably know that when we uploaded conversations from episode 25 over this past weekend, we only uploaded the 38-second voiceover. As I say this on Monday afternoon, we've fixed our website, but those fixes have not made their way yet to the major podcasters. Will not until tonight or tomorrow. Apologies to those of you who never got to hear the actual conversations. They're quite good. You might want to go back and get them now. As a small way of apologizing for any inconvenience we might have caused you, we are giving away t-shirts and sweatshirts from the Global Liver Institute's October is for Livers campaign. Information is up already on our website, LinkedIn and Facebook feeds, and our Twitter and Instagram accounts about how to enroll to possibly win one of these wonderful pieces of clothing. Send us your email address, and we will include you in the drawing that we'll be doing in about a week. So check out. If you'd like to be entered, send your email to questions@surfingnash.com. If you're in our Hep Dynamics or Surfing Nash LinkedIn group, simply message me the word interested. I'll get back to you to enroll you.
International NASH Day is coming.
As I mentioned when the surfers were still here, the Global Liver Institute's International NASH Day is coming on June 10th, kicking off at midnight in Central European time and going throughout the day. The wrap-up is a spectacular cooking class at 6 p.m. Eastern time with award-winning celebrity chef and cookbook author Daniel Thomas. We'll be covering the event on a same-day basis and broadcasting right after Chef Thomas's session ends that evening.
Thanks to our listeners for picking up engagement levels once again.
Thanks for continuing the rebound of our attendance another week. We are now back at our February-March levels without the benefit of as many special events as we had then. If you haven't heard episode 25 yet, I strongly recommend you do so. It's a game-changing paper, a pivotal story. I see that the Pan-NASH Coalition published the paper or put a link to it out on LinkedIn today, maybe based in part on our bringing attention to it last week, I hope. Finally, and as always, I want to thank our exceptional team, Mike Wilson, who will be amazingly challenged by what Steven sounds like out of Panama City and some background issues I had in New Hope today. Eric Rounds, our social media master, and Paul Taylor, who pulls everything together for us, and you, our listeners, who make all this worth doing. So, with that, I wish everyone in the Northern Hemisphere a beautiful spring week with gorgeous flowers, everyone in the Southern Hemisphere temperate weather as you slide towards winter, and everyone everywhere relief from the pandemic. We all pray for India and for other smaller countries around the world whose health systems have been so devastated. We hope you folks can make it through in one piece. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com and we will answer on the podcast or the website.